Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Lyndal. It's a rare day lately when the government gets some good news, but today the Reserve Bank provided it, cutting official interest rates by half of 1 percentage point. It's now over to the banks to decide whether they'll pass it on, in part or in full. The government got another set of numbers today that weren't looking so good. Another poll confirming that the government is again going backwards. Joining me to discuss the day are Labor MP Michelle Rowland and Liberal MP Alan Tudge. Welcome to you both.
G'day Lyndal. Hi Michelle.
We'll go first to interest rates, and shortly after the Reserve Bank made its announcement, we had reaction from both the Treasurer and his coalition counterpart.
Today's interest rate cut and the two before it have been made possible by disciplined fiscal policy delivered by this government. A responsible approach to the budget and disciplined fiscal policy is very, very important given the economic circumstances in which Australia finds itself and given global uncertainty.
Nothing here gives credit to the government. In fact, it's the absolute opposite. The Reserve Bank is moving because the government has lost control of the Australian economy.
Alan, the Shadow Treasurer Joe Hockey relied on part of the Reserve Bank Governor's statement today where it says that growth is economic conditions have been somewhat weaker than expected. But the statement also says growth in domestic demand ran at its fastest pace for 4 years. Unemployment so far remained little changed at a low level, and inflation will probably be lower than expected. That doesn't look like an economy the government's lost control of, does it?
Well, Linda, when you look across the economy, there's clearly weaknesses in many different places. And clearly the government has struggled to get the budget under control. Now, I welcome the Reserve Bank decision today, and I also welcome the statement made by the Treasurer just then when he belatedly recognises that there's a link between fiscal policy and interest rates. And that's something that we've been saying for a long time. And indeed, had the government been in control of the budget over the last 4 years, then we possibly could have had even lower interest rates today, or they could have come sooner, rather than the government having racked up the 4 biggest budget deficits in the history of Australia, which of course keeps upward pressure on interest rates.
But you can't necessarily say the economy's in bad shape because we've got growth. The economy's growing, but it's not growing too fast. Inflation appears to be under control, and unemployment is at a relatively low level.
Listen, by international standards, of course, Australia is doing well. But the question is, can we do better? And that's our argument. And of course we can do better. And we can do better by keeping taxes low, by keeping interest rates low, and by making the business environment more positive for businesses. And that's been our critique of the government, is that they've been putting taxes up. I think it's 19 taxes now they've put up, with the biggest tax, the carbon tax, coming. They've made industrial relations more difficult for businesses, and they've made other conditions brought into account over 16,000 new regulations, making it more difficult for businesses.
Michelle, is the question now how much of this interest rate cut will actually get through to those people who have a home loans and those people running businesses? It's a question now of whether the retail banks pass this on?
Oh, fundamentally, of course, Lyndal. We would urge all the banks to pass this on in full to their customers. And we need to remember that we have made it easier for consumers to walk out and change banks with the abolition of mortgage exit fees. We have made conditions such that people can actually enjoy the benefits of competition between banks. And unlike Andrew Robb, who defends the banks when they don't pass on interest rate cuts, we urge the banks to do so, and we urge consumers to shop around if they're not getting their best deal. And I would also say, Lyndal, it's a bit rich coming from Joe Hockey and the Coalition to criticise the set of figures that have come out lately in terms of inflation, 0.1% for the quarter, in terms of unemployment, which has got a 5 in front of it compared to some of the European economies, which are above 20%, and in terms of our interest rates that we've just seen today. I mean, we have the economic fundamentals right in this country, and that's why the IMF holds Australia up as one one of the leading economies of the world, if not the world's best developed economy.
You said, and the Treasurer has said, that you've made it easier for people to switch banks, and that if people don't like the deal they're getting, they can just go to another bank. But is the evidence that people actually do that, or they are relatively reluctant to change banks?
Lyndal, it depends on the circumstances, of course, of everyone's individual mortgage arrangements with their financial institution. But the fact is that by having these regulations in place, it sends a very clear incentive to the banks to do something to make them more competitive so that they attract and retain customers.
Alan, if we go back through the history of interest rates, you say that there's a clear link between the government's fiscal management and interest rates, but at a time that the coalition was running large budget surpluses, interest rates were actually rising. So hasn't this government managed to do something well, which is keep an economy growing, aim to bring its budget back to surplus, and we'll see if it managed to achieve that, a promise of that next week, and keep inflation low, which does keep interest rates low?
Lyndal, we've always argued that there is a link between fiscal policy and interest rates. We've argued that for a decade now, and the Labor Party has argued the opposite until just a couple of weeks ago. Now, during the Howard Costello era, interest rates on average were still about 25 basis points lower than they are today, or lower than they have been.
Not official interest rates, though.
In terms of effective interest rates, what mums and dads at home pay for their mortgages, and certainly what businesses pay for their commercial loans, on average they're lower than what they've been over the last 4 years. And our argument is that you should always be you should always be in charge of your budget and be running a budget surplus, because you have to only spend what you have. And B, that's a good thing because it always puts downward pressure on interest rates. And this government has run the 4 biggest budget deficits in the history of Australia. $137 billion in debt now, and they are still borrowing $100 million a day. They do so
yet
today,
now it's got official
tomorrow.
interest rates below 4%.
Well, that's right, and our argument is they could be even lower if the government had not, or they could have been lower sooner if the government hadn't been running up such enormous deficits over the last 4 years.
Michelle, is the task next week for the government to deliver a credible plan to return to surplus, even if it means some people wearing some pain of spending cuts?
Well, we do have a credible plan to return to surplus, Lyndal, and we'll see that in the budget next week. And we've always been committed to returning the budget to surplus. It's been said time and time again, and we've had our doubters. The Treasurer has made no bones about the fact that there will need to be some sectors that feel the pinch of a budget surplus. But in the end, it is in the long-term interests of Australia to maintain a budget surplus so that we can have flexibility in our interest rates and the possibility of further interest rate cuts, but also to provide a buffer. We mustn't forget that we need that buffer in a global economic climate where we have the Eurozone basically a basket case. We don't know what the US is going to do in terms of the direction they're taking with their economy, and we just need to ensure that we have that flexibility in place. The importance of returning ourselves to a budget surplus is something that is not lost on the Labor Party at all. It is not lost on this government, and is certainly, I believe, is not lost on the people we represent, the working families who need this interest rate cut and whose sound economic management from Labor has brought this about.
If I could just step in, because we do have to move on.
Sure.
Michelle, you talk about the people you represent. We'll look now at the people that are members of the Health Services Union. They got to see the interim report from into the Health Services Union's East branch, which showed a lack of financial controls over the spending in that branch. The coalition says that there should be much tighter controls over what unions can do. I talked to Senator Erica Betts a little earlier today.
$20 million worth over 4 years being paid out to mates or dealt with in credit cards, etc., in a manner that just bears no scrutiny whatsoever. In those circumstances, you would want more than just a very light civil penalty. The sort of penalties that apply to company directors should be applied.
Michelle, what do you think the members of the Health Services Union should or would be feeling about all the revelations about the union's activities?
Well, I would say, Lyndal, that they would at least know that this government has taken preemptive action, as announced by the Minister, to appoint an administrator to the HSU. Our priority has been those 55,000 members who deserve value for money. I'm a member of a union and I expect value for money from my union, and it is by no means settled what is in the interim report. And can I also say, in terms of Senator Betts's comments there, I mean, we have nothing new in what he's saying here. He wants to appoint himself judge, jury and executioner. He forgets also that while there are allegations in here, and there are allegations that are linked beyond the HSU, beyond what is simply in that report, and I know that they've tried to tie all this in together, he has been happily sitting in a parliament with someone who was facing criminal charges, and yet here he is talking about what civil penalties should be applied. This is an interim report, and it reflects and vindicates the government's very strong decision to appoint an administrator here, which was absolutely the right step to have taken in the interests of those 55,000 HSU members.
Alan, Michelle's right. There are allegations, there are reports, some of which haven't been finalised and some of which haven't been made public yet. There's no definite action that is being taken at the moment about the activities of the HSU, is there?
Lyndal, this report, which was leaked today and in the papers today, has some very serious allegations in relation to the misuse of funds at the Health Services Union, and it just adds to the overall stench of this union and of Craig Thomson and of the Australian Labor Party generally. And I've listened to what Michelle said in relation to appointing an auditor or whatever. What the government could do today is support the opposition's position, which is to establish a new commission which can protect union members from this sort of activity ever occurring again, so that they would have the same powers as the powers which corporate watchdogs have, and there'd be the same penalties which apply to when companies behave appallingly also. That's something that the government and Michelle could support today to protect union members and to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again.
And finally, Michelle, the Prime Minister took action on the weekend against both Mr Thomson and Peter Slipper. Mr Thomson has been suspended from the Labor Party. Mr Slipper is stood aside for longer. How much, though, is this feeding a perception about this government, and how much work does the government have to do to improve its stocks in the minds of voters?
Well, Lyndal, you know, when I'm out in the electorate, and I'm out in the electorate a lot, including in my mother's group these days with my new baby, I can tell you that front of mind is not the issues that you're talking about here. Front of mind are about three things. Firstly, cost of living generally. Secondly, I'm probably the only person in my mother's group who doesn't enjoy the benefits of the paid parental leave scheme that Labor established, and you'll be amazed how many people are actually, women in particular, are taking that up in my electorate. And thirdly, there is the issue of ensuring that their children have the best education. They're concerned about their families. They're concerned about interest rates. They're concerned about ensuring that their day-to-day lives are improved. And they are improved under this government, which has firstly strong economic fundamentals, and that's reflected in what we've seen today in the fall in interest rates. Thousands of dollars a month are going to be saved by these people. So I think when it comes down to it, Lyndal, when you go out into the community and you actually speak one-on-one to people rather than just living on opinion polls, you see what the real deal actually is.
And that's where we'll have to leave it. We've run out of time. Michelle, Rowland and Alan Tudge, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lyndal.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill. Please be with us at the same time tomorrow.